Welcome to Rob Minsky Podcast. It's the month of May, and we're revisiting, obviously, tribute to Mental Health Awareness Month. But remembering our names has been the theme the last few years. I think fundamentally, it kind of the first thing we're given in that regard. But there was a short story I want to share before we begin. There was a well-known speaker that presented a $20 bill to a bunch of students, and he said, "Does anyone want this?" Make a long story short, everyone raised their hands, right? But he asked in different occasions, "What if I crumpled it up? What if I stepped on it? What if I did whatever?" And he still asked the question, "Does anyone still want this?" And they still went ahead and raised their hands. And he kind of presents this idea that no matter what I did to this money, you still wanted it because it never lost its worth. It still was worth $20. And he kind of goes on and actually, expresses that there are many times in our lives that we feel that our lives has crumpled us up and grounded us in the dirt. But I think it's inspiring because he uses such a simple concept to make us see that, our value doesn't always hinge on what happens to us. It may be more about our response to the things that surround us. So I do like how he presents this, and he says it in very much of an elegant way that a lot of us can relate to. Again, the Mental Health Awareness Month reminds me how sometimes the biggest barrier can be ourselves or our families, those trying to help us, not because they want to, just because sometimes it can be mental health is messy. But today we have a returning guest. His name is Dr. Reshie Joseph. Thank you so much for coming on and being a part of the conversation.
Hi, Robert. It's great to be back on again. Thank you for having me.
No problem. At least in the States, I know the crisis line is 988, but I encourage those who are wherever you are around the world, find that group. If you're find those people that you feel comfortable enough to say, "I need help," at the very least. And if you are thinking about harming yourself, I do encourage you to seek professional help. But with that said, welcome, Reshie, again. I think about the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe when I think of C.S. Lewis. Obviously, he wrote the book, but I like what he says here, just because it kind of introduces. This starts us off. It says, "We are what we believe we are." It's kind of this whole concept of reflecting and how we may project. But what do you see when you hear this quote? And anything else you want to share as we begin?
When I read this quote, the first thing that comes to my mind is uh, a statement made by one of the fathers, or the father of cognitive psychology. So we have all of these wonderful branches of psychology, and there's a wonderful story to be told as to how each of these major revolutions happened within our beautiful science.
Mm-hmm.
But if the evolution of cognitive psychology can be attributed to one person, that person would be Aaron T. Beck. And I can't remember where he said this. I think it might have been in a lecture to one of the great universities. He was quoted as saying, "It is not what people say or do that determines how I feel. It's what I think about what people say or do. That is what determines how I feel." Now,
Mm-hmm.
we have since come a long way from that. We know that's an oversimplification. There are many more forces at work. But when I look at this quote, that's the one that springs to my mind because, to a very large degree, it is true. The reality we inhabit is the ones our brains create for us. If I
Mm-hmm.
have a belief system that tells me that I'm not worth very much, that other people are out to get me, that the world is hostile and full of enemies, that I should be on my guard all the time, and that the
Mm-hmm.
future is dark, it's bleak. If I'm walking around with a belief system like that, then
Mm-hmm.
that is the reality that my belief system will very largely create for me. If, on
Yeah.
the other hand, I walk around thinking to myself, well, I'm not such a bad person. I make regrettable decisions, but at the core, I'm actually quite a good person.
Mm.
And that others will see that and they will respond accordingly. They're not there to make my life miserable. They're not out to get me, as it were.
Mm.
It's not dog eat dog. The world's not like that. There are good people to be found. And that the future, if I find these people and connect to them, that the future could be quite a good one. If my belief system created that reality, I'm
Mm.
far more likely to be a happier person. So I think Lewis is correct in this, and I think Aaron Beck certainly was, that
Mm.
those belief systems can really create a world that we inhabit.
I thought a couple of things. I think a few years back, wasn't that woman who kind of was a stowaway and went to Europe and they found her because she thought she was, her world
Mm,
was that she needed to escape. Obviously, I can't recall all the details, but it's, working in this field, you also see that. A lot of times when I hit barriers with people who I'm working with, I ask them this question. It's kind of a weird question. Sometimes they take offense to it. I'm like, "Are you allowed to get better?" And it's weird because it's asking a question that they will be like, "Of course I am." Well, then why why can't you say no to this? Why can't we? Why does everything has to go fast? And I think a lot of it may be societal. How much there's a speed to everything. The world demands speed and progress, success in some sort of arbitrary, objective way, which honestly doesn't really help a person who really suffering. Because objective success is kind of futile. It's like, where do I go from here besides just watching what everyone else is doing? So I ask that question a lot, and a lot of times I get blank stares, and they're like, "What do you mean? I'm here. I want to get help, but like, are you allowed to get better?" That means saying no to things, saying yes to things, and those kind of things. And that's a journey. Of course, I always love to have them think more than me tell. Obviously I have suggestions, but it means nothing if they don't really feel it. If they don't feel like it's going to help them, or they don't feel like they're allowed to get better per se. They wouldn't maybe say it that way because of many different factors. But I do feel that to lend a little further what we're talking about, I do feel that this can be itself a barrier. Any thoughts?
well, Robert, first of all, if we're going to talk about beliefs, I find it almost impossible to believe that anyone could take umbrage at anything you said. So charming you are. That is surely an impossibility. No, I love the way you frame that, uh, and I like it. I was teaching a seminar the other week on group psychotherapy, and group psychotherapy equals one man, Irving Yalom.
Yeah.
So I was going through his, his 11 points. Well, actually, I'm told reliably that it's 12, but I
Mm.
refuse to add the 12 because Yalom didn't write 12; he wrote 11, and I'm.
Mm.
uh, I like to stick with the gold standard. So yes, you know, group psychotherapy principle number one, hope, the
Mm.
installation of hope. And I
Mm.
think when you ask a question such as that one, it's almost as though you're asking, do you actually believe you can get better? Do you actually believe that the decisions that you take
Mm.
based on this conversation, that the thinking changes you institute, that whatever flows from this, do you actually believe that that is going to translate into tangible results? And yes, it can be a very confronting question because
Mm.
sometimes when people stop and really think about it, do they really believe that that is possible? And to quote Yalom directly, why would someone even try if they didn't honestly believe they could get better? Why try?
Mm. Yeah.
So I think you framed the question really beautifully by putting it that way. And
Mm.
in terms of insight, again, not to overquote Yalom, it's why I think he was such an advocate for group psychotherapy. Um, that very often that which we cannot see within ourselves, we are able to see in someone else going
Mm.
through a similar or a parallel process, and in that way can develop insight into, oh goodness me, that's why my marriage failed, or oh
Mm.
goodness me, that's why I drink, or whatever process someone else is going through. And I think insight is increasingly hard to come by, you know,
Hmm.
increasingly, because less and less do we think, and more do we absorb. And it's very easy to absorb information and not think now. So I don't know if that answers your
No,
question.
I think it really does help. I whenever I make goals when I'm working with someone, I always try to emphasize that the goal shouldn't be the primary goal shouldn't for it to be easy. Like easy. Obviously, we're kind of prone to that. Well, convenience. I could order things and they just come to me. That kind of. But when it comes to self development, when I'm working with someone, I ask the question. I try to encourage, obviously, treat the person than what they're going through. And like, at least that model has always been helpful, especially when more delicate cases. But I I feel that when it comes to goals and what the person may have desire, I think a lot of times we can get to the idea that I want to get something, I want to get better quickly, and I want to get better in the most, I guess, the easier route. And I say easier route, not they may not see as easy, but I want less steps. I want less insight. I just want to be told what to do. I want to just feel better. I want to feel better. I want to feel better. And I feel like um, if I were to, I think they miss out. I know myself, my experience with mental health. The biggest growth was when I stopped sharing my story, like stop requiring people to understand what I was going through
Mm,
for me to get better. For me, like when I realized that every single time I was disappointed, 99% of the time they never really got it, and I thought to myself like, well, what step? So that's where the insight, that's where the kind of grueling work of like looking at myself in the mirror and saying, I don't like this part. What can I do about it, step by step? And I think and that's why I try to encourage. But obviously, I guess it's hard. So my question for you is, why have you seen help those suffering personally or professionally in putting value and navigating through this while still taking care of oneself? So it's like not only the caretaker, but also the person suffering. How do you navigate through um, feeling like it's slow? Because I feel a lot of times the biggest hurdle I get with people is that they want things faster. They want to feel better faster because of pressures outside externally. When does the when does the value shift that the person says, it's going to take the time it takes? And I know that's an arbitrary question, but any thoughts or you want to add or share?
going back to what you said previously, Robert, because I thought you said it so beautifully. Um, there are many reasons for why I think this has happened, and we can certainly,
Mm-hmm.
that's a long conversation to have. But one of the key features I'm observing increasingly today is the abrogation of personal responsibility. That,
Mm-hmm.
look, I had this argument. Well, it wasn't. It was a discussion with a colleague
Mm-hmm.
about, certain decisions that she made, and why had she behaved in a certain way, particularly towards our clients. And part of my job is I've got to make sure everybody behaves in a certain way. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a pleasant thing to do, but
Mm-hmm.
there we have it. And so it went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, we got to the point where she really had nowhere left to go. And she pulls this out as though it's a trump card. And I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm simply using this as an example to piggyback on what you said, because I thought it was such an important point. And she pulled it out and she said to me, well, I'm neurodivergent, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And now, neurodivergence, or being on the ASD spectrum, or having a neurodevelopmental disorder, all of these things are very real. They're
Mm-hmm.
brain-based disorders, and we know a great deal about what goes on and why they happen and stuff. But going back to your earlier point, yes, this is part of your story, and it's very important that you tell it. But ultimately the responsibility lies with you to do something about it. There's a wonderful quote wrongly attributed to Viktor Frankl, which goes, there is a space between stimulus response, and
Mm,
within that space is the power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. And this is the crux of everything that I do. The world is full of stresses and
mm,
traumas and stimuli and events and nasty, ghoulish things going on. But if the whole of mental health can be summarized in a single statement, it is, why do I respond to these stresses in this way when the people
mm,
around me respond in that way? What is the reason for that?
mm,
So, saying that I'm neurodivergent or saying that I'm ADHD or saying that I'm an addict is a way of saying, here is why I respond differently. But
mm.
that's the beginning of a conversation, not the end. The
Yeah.
ending of the conversation is, and here's why that response, the addiction, say,
Mm,
really doesn't work either for me or the people around me. And here is what I'm doing to master responding in a different way. I'm
mm,
learning about my behavior, I'm learning about my beliefs, I'm learning about my autonomic nervous system and how it gets
mm,
triggered. I'm learning about my
mm,
environment, that there are toxic people in it, etc., etc. But all of these things, what the person is really saying is, I'm learning to respond to life's stresses and stimuli in a different
mm.
way.
Yeah. And I kind of said this before in other podcasts, and accountability is not a bad word when it's a safe place. And the idea is in that regard, it's a simple concept is that I try to encourage, especially socially, some people. And I mentioned this in the last podcast, but it's harder. And I feel if we try to be around, um, like making the active, I guess, intentional choice to be around people that would actually applaud if you do well. It's a crazy idea. Like actually be feel like, oh wow, you're doing great. I feel good for you. Or actually, and it's hard to come by, but what you also were mentioning made me think about, um just when it comes to mental health, and I if I had to learn disability, I'm not making anything, uh, minimizing the struggles or anything like that. But it does that mean I cannot learn? It means I have to learn differently, and it's
Mm,
when you kind of grasp that, because I feel when we objectively, well, those who struggle with mental health or substance use or dual diagnosis, when we not look at our treatment or our situation as an objective reality, more of a subjective, something that you take account for your background, how you were brought up, what may be a trigger, what things you may still need to work on. I still do this to this day. Even though I'm doing very well and I love what I do, I also understand that sometimes some thoughts are not necessarily needing to be completed in one sitting. So like I may get a little further along in some sort of thought or some sort of approach. It's okay to not finish it. A lot of the thing is the process. The whole, if you, it's just like if you exercise or you're starting to trying to worry about your physical health, you would actually, you're not going to be a marathon runner in one go. You're going to have to work on building that up. But when you enjoy, or at least can respect and be consistent about that process, that's where the bigger kind of improvements, or you can see the bigger sleeps. But it's more about, I feel about, if I don't like practicing like basketball or ice hockey and I want to be a star in one of those things, it's going to be hard, even if I'm very good, because eventually I'm going to hate going to practice, and in that regard. So I think in regards to mental health, a lot of times, um, I feel that the stigma is ambiguous. It's not just, oh, they don't understand. I think it's sometimes the person who's struggling themselves put the stigma on them, like you describing, like, oh, I have, let's say I have schizoaffective, or I have schizophrenia, or bipolar one, or whatever the case may be. Yeah, but you're still, I kind of, I kind of joke, not really joke about it, but I would say we talk about mental illness before mental health. There's no health part. We're talking about mental illness. All these diagnoses are just ways to treat a condition, and there's several different ways to do that. And a lot of times, I actually tell my clients sometimes it's ways they can categorize certain treatment plans for you, but also so they can bill you. That's it. Those are the two ways that I know. But it is important that they organize on all the studies, but it's not who the person is. It's not what their recovery is. It's definitely a good thing to understand. Any thoughts? I don't want to keep rambling. That you want to share?
um, before I came on, I was saying to Robert how enjoyable I find these conversations. 'Cause I can very often say quite salacious and outrageous. Well, here's one. If we look at the mental illness as a even as a construct, as an idea, it's a relatively recent one. But what is very interesting is as um, as mental health became medicalized, it wasn't always so. If we look back early into the into our history, yes, you had people like Freud and
Mm-hmm.
Jung and others, but a lot of the early psychoanalysts and that many of them were researchers or were from different fields. They weren't necessarily doctors in the way that psychiatrists are. And then in the 60s and particularly the late 60s, there was a move through the DSM, the publishing of the DSM and its
Mm-hmm.
ascendancy to wrest control of this massive industry away from others and to put it under the purview of medicine, which it did very successfully. And even the systems that psychologists use now all flow down from that. They're all uh, variations on that theme. You take a history, you make a diagnosis. The diagnosis has to be, in this book that you have called the DSM-5. If it is not, the insurance company won't pay you. So it's the same system. But
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting is right from its inception, there were people from within medicine, within psychiatry, who were very against the idea of mental illness as a construct, and they are largely grouped into two categories: the critical psychiatrists and the anti-psychiatry movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I firmly believe that every person, every human being keeps two sets of books. There is the set of books that we want everyone to think we read, and then there is the set of books that we keep that we really don't want people to know. The sort of
Mm-hmm.
the naughty secret. So if I have a naughty secret, my second set of books is that. Right, the
Mm-hmm.
one where if I had a friend coming around who was a professor of psychiatry, I would start pulling them off the shelves because I could lose a friendship. And what I'm talking about are books like The Divide Itself by R.D. Laing. Brilliant, brilliant book where he basically completely destroys the idea that schizophrenia is an illness. And he strongly advocates for the position that, look, this is simply a different experience of reality. We've
Mm-hmm.
had this as long as human beings have been around. We've had very unkind names for them, like the village idiot or whatever, but these people were always considered to be a part of society and they just had a very odd experience of reality. And we
Mm-hmm.
should move back towards that. Other people, Irving Goffman is one. Some of these men, unfortunately, their work have been taken and they've been used in ways that perhaps they didn't intend. David Cooper is an example of this because I think that is very heavily quoted by the Scientologists, but I'm not sure he intended his work to be viewed in this way. But I think it's important to acknowledge these people because I think they were onto something.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, Lang was instrumental in this. Thomas Satz is another, where they were quite vocal in saying, "Look, are we in fact in danger of pathologizing human experience?" That's
Mm-hmm.
dangerous because human experience is massive and wide and varied, but to equate that to a discernible pathology like uh,
Mm-hmm.
hypertension or heart disease or cancer, we're treading somewhere we shouldn't go. And I sometimes think that these people are onto something, that they saw something and were trying to warn us.
I think it's like I think I see shadows of that what you're describing when it comes to maybe a clinician or someone who's not very culturally aware, and then a person comes in and I've been like this podcast Revive Ministries. The only thing that is really faith based is the fact that I am faith based, but the thing about that, it's only outreach. It's never proselytized. I never want that. It's just part of my identity. However, if I'm working in the Bible Belt of of the United States, I have to be mindful about that. I also have to be mindful of other communities. I'm half Asian, half Korean, actually. And with that said, there's different standards. There's different approaches. So, for instance, just use a vague example: person who's from Haiti, who is a woman who maybe has been sexually abused or something had happened, and the church doesn't believe her, and they push her out, exile. A person like myself, if they don't know, well, they just go to another church. Separate yourself. That's our whole community. That's everyone. That means everyone that she knew when she was growing up or is no longer a part of her. Then they basically disown her because at that point, and it can be very severe. And if the person takes it lightly, it can be very damaging depending on the approach. So sometimes I feel these just putting everything in one box. Oh, just as a simple solution or just kind of grouping it can be dangerous because I know culturally, Asian culture, at least East Asian, my mom being immigrated to the United States in 1979. All right. So it's different. And if we're not careful, we could be claiming something is something that it's not if we're not considering the cultural or environmental situation. So I sometimes feel like if someone um um if you like if I'm a mechanic, I'm gonna think it's a mechanical problem on the car or whatever the case may be. I think it can be dangerous when we try to pathologize per se um people without giving the context of where their upbringing or culture or setting is sometimes, because sometimes it may seem one thing, it may not be that one thing, if that makes sense.
100% agree, Robert. The social context is so important. Whatever uh, work we're doing as mental health professionals, I've had the privilege of working in multiple different countries in,
Mm.
over Southeast Asia, here in Australia, a similar environment in England where I spent part of my childhood and large parts of my adulthood. And certainly one thing that strikes me about these really varied communities and varied places is what is regarded prima facie as a mental illness in one place is absolutely not viewed that way in a different place. And I can't tell you the number of times I've gone somewhere and simply assumed that because I,
Mhm.
the professional, thinks something is a mental illness, therefore it is a mental illness. And I've
Mhm.
and I've come into places. An interesting one is I don't know if you know of this phenomena, the hikikomori. Have you heard of them?
No, no.
I think there are elements of this in Korea as well, but this is actually a Japanese phenomena. The word
Mm.
hikikomori in Japanese means shut in, and it relates to a very interesting response to trauma, or at least
Mm.
that's how I describe it. So you have these Japanese, these stratified societies, and these young, and they're often men, although increasingly we're seeing young women as well, but young men. Often there is a huge humiliation event. They're berated at work or they're berated at school or university. There is some intense shame experience, and what happens is that these young men and increasingly young women will shut themselves into their rooms for decades in some cases. Their parents, no one sees them, and they interact with the world entirely online. And this is not a small community of men. There are over 1 million registered shut-ins,
Mm.
hikikomori, in Japan. And I ran into some Japanese colleagues. I met some very nice Japanese people at a conference
Mm.
last year, and well, I had a Japanese friends. So I thought, oh, great, I've got some theories on hikikomori. And I started talking about, this and this, and I thought it was this, and it was a stress response, and we could do this, and maybe this. And I remember they just looked at me, and one of them sort of said to me, But why do you think that this is a mental illness? This is how, in our society, this is how you will respond if something like this happens. They will come out of it. We just need to support them. And in that
Mm,
moment, I realized I had just gone ahead and made a whole heap of assumptions about a category of individuals in a society I have zero understanding of,
mm,
that were absolutely not shared by the people who live and operate within that society. It was a
mm,
chastening experience, Robert. It really was.
mm, mm. You know, I think workplace is another place that I feel, at least I could only speak from my experience, but although other colleagues who may have experienced, mental health or substance use or dual diagnosis. And the question I pose is like becomes, can I morally be successful with mental health issue and be seen as successful? Or will my mental health issue devalue my success? So it's kind of a weird, but it's for me, I'm doing very well where I'm at. However, I would say at times I could be like, I need to be 90 or 100%, while the standard, I guess, is that they're expecting is 70 or 80. So, what I'm really trying to share is that sometimes in the workplace, even though the person is doing well, there's other barriers. They responded well to treatment, they're doing everything that, and they're quote unquote a success. Life becomes normal. But what I find a lot of colleagues that experience it, their family pretends that time when they struggled never happened. First off, and then they work with and they do very excellent because they feel less baggage. They learn to navigate. But the problem sometimes stems on I guess the volume is louder. So the thing is in their minds, in the sense that, at least from my experience, is that I can also overextend myself in the sense that I feel, and I'm saying this from my own personal experience, that I have to overachieve to achieve. Being someone who knows I suffer from mental illness in the past, and it's not until I stopped and thought and I have to keep practicing to work through those negative thoughts, work through those recurring thoughts. So, and and the question continues in my head, sometimes I'm just giving you an example and see what your thoughts are. If I didn't have mental health issues and was moderately successful with the same parameters apply, it's a kind of like a kind of a existential question. But any thoughts on this? That I thought I just wanted to bring in the workplace because, like, people eventually, yeah, you can get better. You can learn to manage whatever you're going through. But sometimes the what's next, sometimes these little barriers can, at least any thoughts? Sorry.
I have a very interesting experience with this question.
Mm-hmm.
If I go back some 15 years, perhaps a bit longer, in fact, 17, almost 2 decades, right back to the point at which I first discovered trauma. I discovered the work of Steve Porges and Dan Siegel and that wonderful world of Judith Herman, the world in which I now, work in and inhabit, and all my friends are from that world. I remember discovering Alice Miller and childhood trauma, and I remember excitedly telling someone about this and how it accounted for the terrible struggles I've had in life, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember the person to whom I was talking said to me, "Well, didn't your brother have the same childhood as you? And you went to medical school, he went to medical school, he's a really successful doctor, and what the hell happened to you?" and I,
Yeah.
and I remember feeling really upset by that observation.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to be. Uh, I felt very cut by it.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward till today, that observation is quite frequently made, and people say,
Mm-hmm.
"Well, yes, childhood trauma is very important. Attachment, ACs, and all of that. We certainly know they're very real." Um, and many of the people in your family, certainly with siblings, they would have had the same exposure as me, and they certainly didn't turn out the same way. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't have anywhere near that. I don't have that reaction anymore. I
Mm-hmm.
attribute the difference to the need for validation in the first instance, which is, here is my struggle, and I need this to be validated by you, the
Mm-hmm.
interlocutor. And in the second instance, the shift from the need for validation to the ability for affirmation, affirmation being the validation that I give to myself. I no
Hmm.
longer require it from an external source.
Hmm.
Now, I'm unsure as to when and where and how that shift took place,
Hmm.
but I certainly know that it has, because even if I have what will commonly be described as an invalidating experience, where someone
Hmm.
says, you shouldn't complain about that. All the people in your family had the same thing, or your
Yeah.
dad
Yeah.
certainly had it much worse than you, or whatever, right?
Mm.
And I don't find that as invalidating. In fact, I rarely find it to be invalidating, and that
Mm.
perhaps the difference is that the affirmation is now internally generated. I affirm what it is I have to do to stay well every day.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that
No,
would be.
I think you hit it because I feel I'm on that road. Like it doesn't bother me as much. Like I know I journal. I do my own way of processing if there's something bothers me, but it's something that I only recognize, like you mentioned, like after it's like an afterthought. Like it used to bother me much more, like say 5, 10 years ago. You know what I mean? But now I notice it sometimes, depending if setting and situational. But it's a duller sting, if anything. But it's just something that I notice, and I just feel I wanted to mention because people may be doing good, but then there's so much external validation that they're still seeking because they feel they missed it. But like I've learned slowly to get more internal validation so I can not be so hungry for it out externally, but also be more stable. I can only control. I can't control what happens outside. The only thing I could do is control how I respond, and I think that comes with maturity. That comes with time, and also like I still go to therapy to this day. So I'll say that.
Mm,
So it does. It's just kind of working through some of these things. And I think vulnerability a lot of times when I'm speaking or if they're doing podcasts, I want people to know that it's at least from I can only speak from my perspective that just because you're struggling with whatever you're struggling doesn't mean that it ends there. The conversation doesn't end. The sentence doesn't end if you. But there, not to say your situation is even similar to mine, but all I'm suggesting that my hope is me sharing this little bit part of me makes someone else consider thinking about themselves and valuing themselves and taking steps to self care themselves. If that makes sense.
absolutely does. And I hope you won't mind me shamelessly plugging my own program here,
No problem.
a
We're
little
about
bit.
to get there. we're
We're about to
about
get
to
there.
get yeah, we're about to get there. So well let's just get there now because I'm looking at what I think I want to do that and then we'll segue to the next part, the last half. Okay. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Um, the organization that I lead, the program that I've created and refined over the last decade and a half, perhaps 2 decades, and the one I've created here in Australia, everything that I do is based on that one proposition. And the proposition is that traumas, stresses, stimuli, events, big and small, whatever you choose to call them, that these are unavoidable. That it has been so since we were living in trees and came, that it's just how the world is. It's not a kind world. There will always be freak events. There's no way in which to create a world where we can legislate these things away. If you
Hmm.
accept that as a truism, then mastery must be focused on how we are able to respond to these events, to these unkind words, deeds, these whatever these traumas, right? These terrible things that happen to us, and that the whole of the Living Free program, the whole of my um, proposition is how do I master my response? it is the source of self-esteem. It is the source of everything. It is that to be able to curate and to master one's response. And that perhaps the only difference between me today and me of 20 years ago is, and the difference in self-esteem and the difference in how I think of myself, in the need for validation versus the capacity for self-affirmation, that all of that can be traced to the fact that my mastery over my capacity for response is just greater today than it
Hmm.
was 20 years ago. And I can see it in the people that I work with when they grasp this really fundamental point, when they grasp, no, 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 it's not about what other people say or do or what happens in the government, or it's all about how sophisticated, nuanced, and powerful am I to master my own response. If I can master that, that's the only mastery that really, really counts. And the entire Living Free program is predicated on that. Everyone that I work with and uh, teach my system to, every single one of them gets this single critical point.
Yeah, I was gonna actually put your. Let me see here. I know I'll be in the notes, but since you mentioned it, I was just gonna put the actual website. Right, that's it. Right, well, Living
That's
Free
it. Yeah,
today. I would encourage anyone listening, watching to check it out. When it comes to when I adopted, and it sounds simple, when I was really struggling, one thing I noted was I was getting more and more stressed when I was actually trying to get people to understand me. Funny enough, when I tried to get people to understand the struggles, it's not that they didn't care. One concept I learned real quick later on, and it takes longer, it was that people can still support and love me and care for me and not understand what I'm going through. And that's okay. A lot of times there's kind of this transference that they want to like feel, and empathy is great. And obviously I feel it's important to be respectful of those who are suffering. However, if I'm the one suffering and I'm expecting this, it'll not. It was exhausting. I'll be honest. When I started shifting the focus on myself and what would I want, what do I want to improve on, and not looking at the whole picture, but looking at one thing at a time, that was helpful. And that meant I was more active in my mindfulness meditation. That meant me doing progressive relaxation, um, as a habit, as a thing that I did in the morning, and just really knowing what. And sometimes it's trial and error. At least my experience was. Breathing techniques are great, but I also need a cathartic way when I get out for work and it's a long day. How do I process these things? So I just like I'll admit it. I'm a gamer, so I do game a little bit, and I find it because I know for me I'm not the best player. I'm never gonna be the best player. It's not the point. I just like sometimes processing, and it's fun. I like video editing. I do obviously the podcast, but I have my gaming channel. So I just do this just because it helps. A lot of times people come up to me, Reshie, and they're like, "Are you gonna monetize your gaming?" And barely has any subscribers. I like it, but I'm like, no. I do this because I enjoy it. I do like I like learning. Fundamentally, I love sound. Like when I was in high school, I did sound tech. Um, I was kind of musical, but I learned real quick that people are very musical, very good at stuff. So I think some people are like, wow, it must be hard to know that people. No, it's freeing. I know that I'm not going to be the best at this, but at the same time, I'm also enjoying it. It lets me process my feelings. And when I build these kind of systems, per se, of decompressing after a long day, about me needing that extra time, especially when hard things happen, life events, or something happens, or and this happens in my field, losing a client like that, that kind of thing. Those things are hard, and learning to process that and heal from that and all that stuff. Because at the end of the day, I felt that has been a tribute to my success and way of navigating. Along that side is forgiving. I think forgiving, Martin Luther King says it this way: forgiving is not an occasional act, it's an attitude. I feel every day at the very beginning when I started this journey, I had to forgive myself or I couldn't move forward. I couldn't start thinking, oh, I need to have has a validation within. If I don't forgive myself, how would I even do that? I have to forgive myself and start forgiving. And that was part of what helped me. Anything you want to share, Reshie?
Oh, Robert, you do make me feel so terribly old. But I forgive you for it. I certainly need a lot of forgiveness from the people I work with. Look, I just remembered that I have this beautiful podcasting microphone that my young marketing assistant here got for me.
Mhm.
I completely forgot I had it, and I'm not using it. I also have these beautiful wireless things that she's gotten for me, and I don't use those either. So, if if forgiveness is part of this matrix, I need a lot of it from the people I work with, and where gaming is concerned. I'm sometimes troubled because increasingly I'm aware of a world that is becoming more and more distant.
Yeah.
And the longer I leave it, the more remote it is to me.
Mm.
The world of social media. I
Mm.
know the brain mechanisms involved, and I know what happens with dopamine systems and stuff. But
Mm.
I don't go. I've never been on Instagram, or I
Mm.
have, but not in a meaningful way. I don't use it. I never learned how to use it. TikTok's the same, Facebook, you know, certainly the world of the gamer, the world of sort of Minecraft and Warcraft
Mm.
Fortnite and these
Mm.
names that I hear through. I've never ventured into these
Mm.
worlds at all, and they're just becoming increasingly remote to me. um, and a world that I sort of struggle to understand. But the way in which I relate to it is, if I understand correctly, all of these things are acts of or attempts at autonomic nervous system regulation. And I think
Mm.
increasingly that all of mental health is really an attempt at the individual to stay well regulated, because the ability to think flows from that, the ability to make decisions flows from
Mm.
that, the ability to
Mm.
engage in a healthy way with one's environment and maintain connections, um, stable relationships, all of it comes from
Mm.
the ability of the individual to stay autonomically well regulated. If your autonomic nervous system is set up for threat, then none of it is
Mm.
possible. Human relationships are not possible. Work functionality is not possible.
Mm.
Nothing is possible, really. And if it is its opposite, which is in a state of collapse, depression,
Mm.
immobilization, etc., then nothing is possible either.
Yeah.
So whether you're like me, an older guy whose acts of regulation is blasting 100 kilometers on his bicycle, or going to the
Mm.
gym and lifting weights, or getting out there and surfing a few waves, doing that, or whether or meditation, which we all do,
Mm.
or if it is to spend some time gaming, or spend some time on social media, or spend some
Mm.
time gathering information in this new particular way. I think the person who are doing all of these different things are trying to achieve the same goal, which
Mm.
is they are trying to start the day in a well regulated, an autonomically well regulated state.
Mm.
And as we say to the clients here, and as I say to my clients around the world, if I'm able to do that, if I'm
Mm.
able to meet whatever challenges life throws at me, an irate CEO or an irate partner or whatever it is, if I'm able to meet these challenges and I'm able to stay in what Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance. In other words, I'm not panicked or aggressive in a state of hyper arousal, or collapsed and depressed in a state of hyper arousal. If I'm in
Mm.
that window, then all things are possible. They don't
Mm.
necessarily happen fluidly, but at least they're
Mm.
possible. It
Yeah.
is possible for me to think in a subtle and nuanced way, where I'm able to say, well, you know. people don't understand all of me, but they may understand some of me. That shades of gray thinking, right? Not all Israelis are monsters. Some of them are, some of them not. Same with the Palestinians, same with the Ukrainians, same with the Russians, right? I can see these shades of gray. I can also make good decisions. I can also engage healthy behaviors. I can also interact with my environment in a healthy way. But all of these things begin with or are intertwined with a well regulated somatic nervous system, a well
Mhm.
regulated autonomic nervous system. And if you're young and sprightly like Robert, then you do so with gaming and
Well,
and
like I feel like I need to expound with like I do gaming, but I don't really do online. I don't play with anyone. I cut videos and I make. It's more of a creative template for me. For me, I love me and my brother. Just when we were young, we played games. It's kind of nostalgic for me. But beyond that, I do meditation, like I said. I also walk. I love the walking in some of the nature that we have around here. I
mm,
think diverse is like when I was in one part of my life, I was in the business side of things in college, and it's like diversifying your portfolio. I had to kind of have diverse. Like it couldn't just be gaming, or that wouldn't work. For me, it had to
mm.
be a diverse kind of things that I can do to oscillate in a level that helps me be ready for tomorrow, be feeling that I'm engaged enough, but not overstimulated, not overwhelmed. So it's like finding that. So like for me, I don't like online gaming personally just because it's too much for me. Like for me, I like games that could has a story, that could play with video content, that kind of thing. So it's I feel it's putting just the stamp personally for me saying gaming. It's not really as accurate because I really just I cut so much video and I make my own like I guess visual diary online on what I'm experiencing. So I think everyone has I do encourage that kind of diverse approach when you are trying to find what may be helpful in regulating your day
I
to
think
day.
that's a very important point because I so often get asked, particularly by parents, but by people in general, is gaming bad or is social media damaging? Or in the same way that parents in my parents in 40 years ago said, is television bad for children? I think in a way we're asking the wrong question because we have to look at what effect that thing has on that individual. So for someone like you who has good boundaries in place, who's been thoughtful about this, mindful, if you want to say it that way, who's been thoughtful and who's thought, how do I use this in a way where this is the intended effect? The intended effect is if I use it with these parameters in place, I don't go online, I don't, if I do it like this, then the net effect is a somatic nervous system that is well regulated, that stays within the window of tolerance more easily, that allows me all of the benefits of that. Now, a different person may be doing exactly the same thing, but in a way where it has the opposite effect. Social media is the same, food is the same, exercise is the same, everything is the same. It is what is the intended effect, and does the person achieve that? In some people, the net effect is a well regulated nervous system, but for others, it's the opposite. So it really depends on the effect that thing has on the person. Nothing can prima facie be said to be either good or bad.
Yeah.
As Shakespeare said in Hamlet, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, which is the heart of the cognitive equation. But I would extend his argument and say none of these things, on the surface of things, ab initio, none of these things are good or bad. It's You have to look at the effect that it has on people. And for some people, it can be a profoundly good thing. And yes, I include social media in that. I know people who engage with social media in a way that is very well boundaried, very mindful, very thoughtful, very intentioned. They go in there knowing exactly what they're using it for, and they get those precise effects. And it does not impact, relational functionality, social
Mm.
functionality, occupational,
Mm.
personal. It doesn't have any of those effects. So I would say of those people, they're using it rather than it using them. But then
Yeah.
there are other people who doom scroll for 10 hours and no one ever does that and tells me they feel better as a result. So
Hmm.
and I'm sure there is the gaming equivalent of doom scrolling for 10 hours.
Yeah. I
There is
think.
also this there is also the same for exercise and for food and
Mm.
for books and for all of these other things that the older
Mm.
amongst us do. Sorry, Robert, I
No,
interrupted.
no, it's fine. Like I remember when people ask me, and when they do watch my video, they're like, "Wow, that's pretty good. Why don't you monetize it?" When they say that, I'm like, first, I don't have enough subscribers, but the second thing is I don't tell anyone about the channel. I don't care. Like I say this not because I don't care about what I'm doing. My whole thing is I'm just trying to. I find it an exploratory expression of creativity. So I'm just trying to get it. So they're like, oh, that's great. They're looking at what what I may be able to get. For me, I'm looking at what it's giving me right now. So like for me, I don't feel that I love the avenue of when I do a video per se, even like podcasts or when I'm doing the actual editing of the audio. I'm never gonna be like, oh, um this one I did the audio. Like there's never like this nexus point where like I got it. I always feel like I'm always trying to new ideas. I try new, especially with my gaming. More so, I try new audio techniques, and I'm like, I like that, but no. Then I try to switch it. It's kind of like experimental for me. I find it very cathartic and creative in my journey through that. So that I feel is why my experience, like you mentioned with the social media, is very different. It's actually has, I guess, in some ways, helped me. I don't see it any different if I was painting a canvas. If I was actually doing some sort of art project or art thing, it's allowed me to express myself in a different medium. If that makes sense.
I can only speak for myself, but as someone who gets invited on podcasts on quite a regular basis, the
Mm,
real value of speaking to yourself, Robert, knowing that your audience is a much smaller one, and that you're more mindful about the monetization aspects, and you're not out there plugging yourself in the way that
mm,
many of these others are, who have massive audiences, and I've been
mm,
on those quite recently as well. But the real value is there are things that I would say here that I would talk about that I wouldn't in these other platforms. I go into
mm,
these platforms, I'm much more cautious. Certain things I
mm,
wouldn't say. I certainly would not really say what was on my mind in the way that I would with the real value of someone like yourself who position themselves in the marketplace in the way that you have so mindfully is it gives someone like me a platform to say what's really on their mind. So, for
mm.
example, quoting David Cooper, especially since he's been co-opted by Scientology, there's no way I would go on.
Yeah.
I recently was on a podcast with Dr. Deborah Lynn,
Mm,
who's the number one PTSD podcaster in the world.
mm.
Very nice lady, you know, had a really amazing conversation with her, but then I would not be quoting R.D. Lang and
Yeah, yeah,
David
yeah,
Cooper on there.
yeah.
That would be the end of that. The
Mm,
microphone would be cut and I'd be ushered out
yeah,
the, the
yeah.
electronic door, so to speak. So, but I think if I'm given a, a thoughtful brain and a listening ear and a chance, I
Mm,
can say, look, there are things from these people that ideas that they had that are still valid, that we
mm,
shouldn't view them in this black and white. No, 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 these people are verboten. We need to,
mm.
this cancel culture way
Yeah.
of looking at it. We need to get rid of these people. I think Satz and Lang and even David Cooper had very valuable things to say. I think what they wrote, what they said, should still be part of the conversation. And having a conversation with you allows me to say that I cannot
Mm.
tell you how valuable that is.
Mm.
really for me.
As we continue thinking about Mental Health Awareness Month, I do want to just stretch on the point, not minimizing those who are caretakers, those ones who are supporting those who are suffering. There's Natita Prakash says things not to say to someone with mental illness. Ignore it. Forget about it. Fight. You're better than this. You're overthinking it. A lot of times when I hear this, and I'll get your insight, I feel it's the discomfort. When I think back of the sanitarium and those times, the people were brought in because they were nuisance to the family. So the focus was not on the client; it was really about them not being a nuisance. So a lot of times there's going to be discomfort when I'm a lot of times with clients or their family. I sometimes get to the point when we're going around in circles. Like, when was it ever easy? The point is, mental health isn't easy. That's why it's something that people try to find ways to work through, and there's a lot of different. So I feel sometimes the temporary discomfort when seeing someone suffering, and I feel it's if I I can't imagine if I was a grandparent or parent who never experienced mental health in my whole life, and also my grandkid is experiencing severe acute symptoms. It's jarring, and the question, and I just want to get through sometimes I just want to. Sometimes what I find helpful is asking the right questions. Mental health is messy. You struggle, and I just want to share a few ones that I thought of that has helped. I asked myself, what is the priority of the person suffering? Mental health or personal discomfort? The whole thing is there's going to be a little bit of personal discomfort when you're going through mental health symptoms. Other thing I ask is include the person suffering from mental health issues in the planning process. A lot of times I see people try to skip over it because they feel that they know what would help them, but I find the even if it works for a little while, it does hurt the person's self worth or image. Get help. Don't ignore it. A lot of times, nothing will nothing will change, and nothing changes. So sometimes, I'll just get over. And I've experienced that significantly when someone had a life event. The person was doing amazing until she wasn't. Until she got promotion, all this stuff. She's doing well, and then attempted suicide just out of nothing. So the thing is to remind yourself that nothing will like these things just don't go away. When it comes to certain life events, losing a loved one or anything like that. And lastly, I ask yourself why this situation matters. Not because of some objective reason that I care about mental health. Let's be honest, we're so biased. If we're really honest, the more we care about the person suffering, who is it? That's why I always kind of keep this name. Remember their names. Remember the names of the ones suffering because you won't understand everything. I already said that. Like I would try to explain it. It's not that. That's not the point. The point is you can still support someone. You can still love someone. You can still be there for someone who is suffering, and vice versa. So, any thoughts as we kind of wrap things up, Reshie?
Perhaps I could present this in a much more old-fashioned, and for some reason, it's a point of view that has fallen out of favor, but one that I find particularly charming, and that I like, to be honest, is the Jungian perspective, where Jung's concept of who we are is that there is a persona, the superego, if you like, the
Mm-hmm.
idealized version, the version of ourselves we present to the world, polite, we do the right thing, we're mindful, and we say the right thing. And then there's the shadow, the hidden dark side of ourselves, the part of ourselves that just wants to take and to do and to do all those uh, animalistic urges, but also where we're very spontaneous, very creative. Jung described a lot about the shadow. And then there is the ego that balances these two forces. And the self is really the combination of all of these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
All three. If mental health has a point, when I hear that quote from Miss Prakash, when I hear people say things like, "Oh, look, don't worry about it. You're better than this," or "Look, what I'm really hearing in the Jungian universe is I don't know how to deal with your shadow. So can we just move into your persona, please?
Yeah.
Right. Which is you say the right thing, I say the right thing, we all feel great. You know, it's all
Mhm.
Jungian persona. Those of us who choose to work in mental health really do so because what we're saying to people is, well, the shadow is there, whether you like it or not. He
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
there, and he is lurking in the background. And if you don't attend to him, he will come back, and he will come back with a force that becomes destructive. And it may lead to, a no laughing matter, very regrettable, it may lead to suicidality when someone cannot square that circle and they keep suppressing that part of themselves. It can have very dire consequences: an addiction, suicidality, depression, anxiety.
Mm.
All of these things, in one way or another, is a shadow that has not been reckoned with. Some years ago, when I was first going through the first sort of very, very distressing component of getting divorced, a therapist that I was seeing, I remember saying to me, one of the things that you're here is to do is you're here to take the measure of your own vileness. And I thought, what a thing to say. But she was right,
Mm.
because if you've ever lived through a divorce, you will know you have to be utterly vile to someone you once loved. It just seems to be part of the equation.
Mm.
It is just how things unfold. Unfortunately, everyone to whom I've spoken tells me the same thing. You really do have to think and behave in ways that engages your shadow. Really vile, unpleasant things that one has to do is part of the equation. One must take the measure of that, Robert. We absolutely
Mm.
must. And if therapy has a purpose, it is to engage with that vile, shadow, dark part of ourselves. But that part of ourselves needs expression and not suppression.
Mm.
So, if there is a reason why you and I exist, it is to give a space for people to express that without fear of judgment, fear of
Mm.
derision. Um, so, I'm not even sure if I'm answering your question, but I've just
Mm.
chosen to answer it
No, no. I
in your way.
think I think it's it's all it's it's uncomfortable. A lot of times, the elephant in the room is that you know you know sometimes parents or people struggling or caretakers, they over read what they can do and these steps, and I'm not saying they're not helpful, but at the same time, um, I do feel sometimes the avoidance of discomfort. It's kind of odd to me because, like, we're talking about mental illness. We're definitely talking about discomfort. That's why there are systems in place and there's certain treatments that can be helpful. But sometimes, we try to hedge the uncertainty. We try to quicken, and I feel what helped me, and this is my final thought, and get your final thought. What helped me was discovering that I'm valuable enough to take the time to do the work to get better. So the question in the beginning, am I allowed to get better? I can actually say yes, and that's a huge step because there are times when it's hard, but at the same time, if you could get there, that you can say I allowed to get better. So you can self advocate. You can self advocate for yourself. You can say, okay, this didn't work. You're not telling providers or people like us what they think we want to hear. Like things are not working. They're like, oh, things are great. And things are great. Things are great. That was like too many greats. So I ask, the whole thing is, are you allowed to get better? Are you allowed the time? The time is a commodity we can't take, but the pressure of time being fast, being done quickly, it means that you don't feel you're allowed to be better for a elongated time. You're not allowed to recover. That may take longer than you expect because you feel that you only have a short period because you don't feel very valued. You don't feel you're valued enough that you can get better. So, with that being said, that's my final thoughts, especially remembering that we are biased, we are subjective, especially mental health. I think it's important to be personable about, well, to look inward about why certain things don't work and ask for help. Especially, these things may take time. Reshie, final thoughts.
My final thoughts I would summarize in this way. I learned a long time ago that if someone I'm with, or if I say, or someone I loved, or someone I was with, or a client had feelings that made me uncomfortable, as they very
Mm,
often do, that the best thing I could do for that person in that moment was to first of all not to rescue them from that experience. That's part of their journey. It's part of
mm,
their experience. They ought not to be rescued from it. They ought to be given the dignity of that process.
mm,
So my final thoughts really are that where I think I've grown the most and continue to grow is where the people around me are able to grant me that privilege, to are able to say, no, we're not going to rescue you from whatever difficult. We'll support you. We'll be there
mm,
for you. We'll listen. We'll do all of that, whether it's a therapist or a family member or a dear friend, where they say, we'll do all of those things, but we are not going to rescue you from the difficult experience or emotions you're experiencing. We're going to give you the dignity of figuring that bit out for yourself. And there's real dignity in that struggle and the
mm.
sense of esteem that flows from the ability to conquer that, that's worth sticking around for, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much, Reshie, for coming on and sharing your insight with us today. It's always a pleasure. Again, if you are listening and you have something you want to share, you're thinking about maybe being a guest, I encourage you to email us to info provide ministries FL. We're always looking for new perspectives. But again, thank you so much, Reshie, for coming on and sharing your insight. This is goodbye from Revive Ministry Podcast, leaving you with the last quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us.